I want to bring in my panel, Shadow Cabinet Secretary Jenny McAllister and Liberal MP Tim Wilson. And Tim Wilson, I'm going to start with you. Is a raid like this acceptable? What do you make of the AFP raids into a journalist doing their job, informing the public?
Well, as a parliamentarian, PK, my focus on making sure proper process was followed because we have national security laws for a reason, because we have to make sure we preserve and protect our national security and make sure that Australians are safe. But when there is leaked information, there must be proper investigation and proper processes. And as you outlined in your introductory remark, there was a process. It was executed on a warrant from a court. Now, beyond that, we've got to be very careful about what else is said, because this investigation is ongoing, but it's important that those steps were gone through. Jenny McAllister, are you alarmed by this story?
Look, we don't have a lot of information about it beyond that which you've outlined now, that there has been a raid. This really is actually an operational matter for the AFP. And in general, I do have confidence that the AFP operate properly and appropriately. They've got a fair bit of operational independence. It's quite difficult to make any sort of specific comment about the story as it unfolds now.
OK, but there's a bigger public interest question here, and I am going to push you on it one more time. Starting with you, Tim Wilson, don't the public have a right to know? Journalists, of course, receive sensitive information to raid their homes, to go through their phones where they speak to confidential sources. This is a pretty serious breach of fundamental journalism here.
Well, again, I'd have to look at the detail of it, and some of that information is only coming to light. But there's actually a separation of the issues. There's information that's available to a journalist and whether they should report on it and whether it puts at risk people's lives and those sorts of things. And then there's obviously the how that information may have been leaked and whether somebody has broken the law to do so. And we need to separate out those two components. So,
well, it's about getting journalist sources. That's why you raid their home.
But there's also, but you need to separate out the two components. There's the source, and there's the choice of the journalist to published information. That's why, based on everything I've seen so far, there's no specific allegation made against the journalist. The issue is whether somebody has leaked classified or information national security, and that's where it is. But again, like Jenny, we need to make sure that proper processes are followed, and the AFP has done the right thing by going and executing a warrant that has been legitimately issued by a court.
Jenny McAllister, is it something that the Labor Party will seek answers on, given, I think, the potential chilling implications for journalism and public interest journalism?
When we've had these conversations about our laws more broadly, putting aside today's case, we have been really concerned to make sure that the laws strike the right balance between providing, appropriate safeguards around genuinely secret information that is relevant to our national security. That's a first-order priority for governments. But, of course, it is also a first-order priority to maintain democratic safeguards. Those two things are occasionally in tension, and I guess the approach we've taken on the legislative front is to try and make sure that they're in balance, and that's how we'll always approach it. I sit on the PJCIS, the committee in the parliament that looks at intelligence questions, and whenever we're asked to look at legislation, they're the big questions that Labor asks. Is this burden on privacy or whatever intrusion might be suggested warranted and proportionate to the threat that we're seeking to address?
OK, moving to the RBA's decision to cut interest rates to a new record low of 1.25%. Tim Wilson, you've previously questioned the need to cut interest rates, suggesting it would hurt those who are heavily essentially depend on savings. Older people, retirees, obviously. What's your view today?
Well, that's actually a misrepresentation. What I've questioned is whether the benefit or claimed benefit is greater than the cost. And so the logic behind interest rate cuts is you cut rates, stimulate the economic activity because more people have disposable income in their wallets because they're paying less on their mortgages. With an ageing population and more people taking a defensive strategy around their investments, so other people are losing out and getting a reduction in their disposable incomes when you reduce interest rates as well, and they need to be balanced out. We've also just had a federal election where where most of anyone who owns, invests or has worked a day in their life is a huge relief because they've lived in the threat and terror of a Labor government, and there hasn't been a lot of employment or investment as a consequence. My view was just that we should let that wave through. Now, in light of that, the RBA has come up with a different decision. I agree with the Treasurer that they should follow through and deliver the full interest rate cuts. And it's disappointing to see the ANZ come to an alternative decision. They've been under heavy scrutiny under the Economics Committee when I was the chair in the last parliament, and a lot of the banks had significant remediation costs, and I just wonder whether they're not passing it on to cover up on their past errors.
OK, but I have to just push you a little further on this. Given you are concerned about older Australians and the point that you make, will you be disappointed if there are further cuts to the interest rate?
As I said, that's a mischaracterisation of what I said. I questioned whether it was going to deliver the benefit that people claim. This goes back to a paper the RBA did in 2012, which said actually the benefits of further interest rate cuts are questionable as the population ages and whether it stimulates the economy. So I made it, pretty well known that I wasn't convinced that there was a benefit to cutting rates, and I maintain that view. The RBA has obviously taken a different view. They're entitled to do so, but I'm going to stick with my existing proposition, because I think when you look at the flow-on consequences from the election, investment, employment activity and retail sales as well as property transactions, there may be follow-through and it may not be justified in the future.
Jenny, what's your view?
Well, it's a pretty big red flag for the government about their economic management, isn't it? I mean, the reason that the RBA has intervened today is very clearly to stimulate the economy in an environment where it's been flat for a long time. One of the key reasons is because wages are flat and demand is down. Consumer demand is down, and it's because the government really doesn't have a plan for growth. So this is the RBA stepping in to meet a gap created by a government that has done very little on the economy. They've spent a lot of time talking about the Labor Party. In fact, it became a sort of running joke on Twitter that sort of Josh Frydenberg spent all of his time talking about the Labor Party. Very little work done by the Liberal Party to manage the economy. And this is the big challenge they face now. They've formed a government. It is their responsibility. I heard Tim talk about sort of Labor policies. You can't blame other people anymore. Every time something goes well, Mr Morrison's the first to put his hand up and say, yeah, I claim responsibility for that. Well, when things are going poorly, they have to take responsibility for this. And this is now a problem that they need to start managing in a far more serious way than they've done to date.
And in breaking news, the NAB will reduce all standard variable rate home loans by the full percentage that's been recommended. So we've got the two banks that have said yes, and including the CBA now. And of course, it's the other one, the ANZ, that isn't passing on the full rate. Tim Wilson, just talking about tax cuts, because that's the next big debate that's going to be had when the Parliament comes back. It's been revealed that the Prime Minister knew he wouldn't be able to pass this tax cut by July the 1st. Do you acknowledge the Prime Minister misled the public when he knew it, but he kept saying people would get it on July 1?
I don't think that's an accurate clarification. Just go back to the point on interest rates. It's another one of the stimulatory effects that's flowing through. The government was elected on a platform to deliver these tax cuts. The challenge we've had is the AEC delivering and returning the writs so that we can recall the Parliament, so that we can pass these before the 1st of July. That's always been the intent. That will continue to be the intent. But unfortunately, the AEC, and not being critical of them, needs to go through the full election processes. As soon as we can pass those tax cuts, we will. The only barrier between us being able to deliver those tax cuts and the Australian people is the Labor Party, who have not committed to support and acknowledge the mandate of the government to pass it through the House and the Senate so we can get on with the job.
Jenny McAllister, are you satisfied by that answer?
I'm not, Patricia, because the government made a promise that these tax cuts would start on the 1st of July. But Mr Morrison himself set the date for the return of the writs on the 28th of June. He has known for the entire period of the election that there wasn't any way that the legislation required to put these tax cuts in place on the 1st of July would take place under the timetable that he set. And yet he made the commitment over and over again. It's not good enough. This was an important test, being honest and straight with the Australian people about how you're going to proceed. There was no need to tell this untruth. And yet they did it. They knew that it wasn't possible to deliver, and they said it over and over again during the election. should have been straight with people.
If we could just run through some other issues, which are very big issues, but we don't have a whole lot of time. Let's just talk about the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. Of course, the big four corners on this yesterday. Today's the anniversary. A lot of people just thinking about the awful ramifications of that day. Tim Wilson, I'll begin with you. We try very carefully to run this very careful line where we continue this relationship with China, but at the same time make points about not accepting what happened on that day. Are you concerned that that's a difficult thing to do? Perhaps we don't get that line right, given just how horrendous that was and what it's meant, what a chilling effect it's had on Chinese people since.
Well, our relationship with China continues to evolve, and of course we have a strong economic trading relationship. It's in our interests and it's in their interests. We want to help them lift millions of their citizens out of poverty at the same time, but we should never forego our opportunity and obligation to stand up as a free nation, to call on other countries to promote democratic freedoms and civil liberties as well. So did that day have a huge impact on movement for greater freedom in China? I mean, there's no point pretending otherwise. Of course it did. And so these anniversaries provide an opportunity to remind not just Australians never to take our own freedoms for granted, but to recommit to the ambition for freedom for every person, no matter which country they're in.
Jenny McAllister, should Australia be more outspoken about human rights in China in the wake of the 30th anniversary? What lessons should it teach us and what behaviour should we change?
Yeah, well, the 30th anniversary is really significant, and particularly for a lot of Australian people of Chinese heritage. You know, it's actually a pretty sad day for a lot of those people and an important day for Labor, given this day in particular when, you know, Bob Hawke so recently having passed and the very significant role he played at that time. On the question around how we approach China, Penny Wong's been really clear about this for a long time. We approach China with respect. We engage with China as a really important neighbour, but we always do it, you know, conscious of our interests. And one of our distinct interests is in being a democratic nation and supporting democracy as a general principle. It doesn't mean that that's the subject of every conversation that we have with China, and you know, we have lots of productive reasons to engage with China. We approach China with respect, not with fear. But yes, our democratic values are one area where we actually do differ with them, and I don't think we do need to shy away from that.
If we could just commit just a couple of minutes on this before we finish up. Religious freedoms. Now, this is going to end up in a piece of legislation by the government, Tim Wilson. Some of your colleagues are pushing for religious beliefs to be exempt from employment contracts. Do you think that should happen? How should this be tackled?
Well, what the government's talked about is having a Religious Discrimination Act. Now, we have the Sex Discrimination Act, the Racial Discrimination Act. Religion is one of those areas in Commonwealth law where you can be lawfully discriminated against, and what we're saying is we're going to plug that gap. Now, I don't think that's overly controversial. The detail of it needs to be worked through to make sure that it's right, but that's quite different from a Religious Freedom Act. And the reality is freedom of religion includes people of faith and without faith, because that's a legitimate exercise of your freedom of conscience as well. So once you start going down that path of a Religious Freedom Act, what you're actually arguing for is a Human Rights Act. Now, Liberals have consistently argued against that because we empower bureaucrats and unelected judges to be able to make decisions about the limits of our freedom rather than the Parliament and people's natural right to be able to live their life freely. So I have deep concerns about going down that path, because all you'll end up with is a Human Rights Act, and that isn't the basis in which I was elected. In fact, it was one of the core principles of which I was elected to oppose.
How about you, Jenny McAllister? How will you approach this government bill? We haven't seen it, but particularly within the parameters there that Tim Wilson outlined.
Well, with respect to Tim, I don't think Tim is setting the parameters of the government approach to this legislation.
Well, he said this is one approach and this is the other approach.
Yeah. Well, he is one of many voices putting their view forward about how this all ought to be approached. I note that Mr Porter is out there saying that this is a top priority for the government. I would ask this question: if that was the case, why wasn't that signalled in the election? You know, we've just had quite a long election campaign. I didn't hear Mr Porter or Mr Morrison out there talking about this during the campaign as a top priority. but now it is. You know, we will look at any legislation that the government brings forward, and the Labor Party is committed to protecting people from discrimination on religious grounds. We had the Ruddock Review. It didn't find that there was any sort of really acute need for legislation of this kind, but let's see what the government proposes. I guess I would just reiterate the point that you've got lots of different voices on the Liberal and National parties talking about what they want. There's no real clarity about what the government intends to do here. Just a lot of talk at this point.
Well, when we see the bill, we'll be able to have a proper and informed debate about how far it goes. Or
yeah, correct.
Clearly there'll be a range of views on that, which we just heard there. Look, I want to thank both of you for coming in and being prepared to talk about a range of issues with me. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.